Andrew Davies wasn't expecting anything unusual that day. He came home early to a house he barely recognized anymore. Quiet, still, hollow. Just like always. But then he heard something. Laughter. Soft. High-pitched. Real. It stopped him in his tracks. He followed the sound down the hallway, confused, heart beginning to race, and when he stepped into the grand parlor, what he saw... A silver pot on the maid's head, his children in her arms, both of them laughing, and calling her a word they'd never said before. Mama. He froze, because that word wasn't supposed to live here anymore. Every morning, Beatrice Taylor walked through the gates of the Davies estate like someone trying not to wake a sleeping giant. She was quiet, careful, invisible. She'd been hired to clean, nothing more. The nanny had quit weeks ago, and no one seemed in a rush to replace her. So the twins, just 2 years old, wandered the halls in silence. They hadn't spoken a word since the day they were born, since their mother died giving them life. Beatrice was told not to get involved, not to touch, not to speak. But silence has a weight to it, and in this house it was crushing. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rolled low over the hills, Beatrice found herself sitting cross-legged on the parlor floor, a pot on her head, a smile she didn't expect curling across her face. Alan and Mavis stared at her and giggled. Then a tiny voice broke through the stillness. Ma! Beatrice looked up. Mavis was reaching for her. Mama! Alan added, louder. Upstairs, Andrew had just stepped inside. He heard it too. Laughter, voices, a word that nearly took him to the ground. And when he walked into the room and saw what was happening, he didn't speak. He just stood there, staring, as if the whole world had shifted and no one warned him. But before we begin, click subscribe, like this video, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. I hope this story reminds you that healing doesn't always knock. It walks in when you least expect it. Beatrice Taylor had never worked in a house this quiet before. The kind of silence that didn't just fill the air. It filled your chest, thick, heavy, like grief that hadn't learned how to sit down yet. She arrived each morning just before sunrise, curls tucked under a scarf, hands warmed by cheap gloves, and a whispered promise to herself, just get through the day. The estate was massive, 20,000 square feet of polished floors, velvet drapes, and hallways wide enough to echo memories. Andrew Davies didn't say much. Grief had carved hollows beneath his eyes, and his words, when they came, were brief, polite, distant. The twins were the same. Alan and Mavis, barely 2, drifted through the house like shadows. Big eyes, quiet mouths, watching everything, saying nothing. Their mother, Juliet, had died giving birth to them. And from that moment on, the house forgot how to breathe. Beatrice wasn't supposed to interact with the children. That's what the nanny had been for. But after she quit without notice, no one stepped in. The staff kept their distance. Andrew buried himself in business, and the children wandered. She tried not to notice them at first. That's what the rules were for. Clean, cook, disappear. But some silences are too loud to ignore. One afternoon, as clouds rolled over the hills and the rain began to tap against the window panes, Beatrice found herself in the parlor, folding linens near the fireplace. Alan peeked around the corner, sock-footed. Mavis followed, dragging a blanket behind her like a cape. They didn't speak, but they didn't leave either. So she stayed. She took the silver mixing bowl from the sideboard, placed it gently on her head. "Where's Alan?" she whispered, eyes wide, voice playful. The little boy tilted his head, curious. "Is he hiding under the table?" she gasped, crawling dramatically across the rug. "Or behind the chair?" A giggle. Quick. Soft. Mavis clapped once, startled by her own delight. And then it happened. The girl took a step forward, reached out a hand, and with the tiniest breath said, "Ma." Beatrice froze. Alan's face lit up. "Mama," he shouted, clear, proud, loud enough to wake the silence. Her hands dropped to her lap. Her throat closed. She wasn't their mother. She wasn't even allowed in the nursery. But in that moment, they didn't care. And neither, If she was honest, did she? What none of them knew, what she didn't hear, was the sound of keys hitting the entryway table, the creak of polished shoes on marble, the breath Andrew Davies held in his chest as he heard something he hadn't heard in over 2 years. His children, laughing, speaking. He stepped toward the parlor, slowly, then stopped. There she was, the maid, kneeling on the floor, kitchen pot on her head, tears in her eyes. His daughter clung to her side. His son pressed his face to her chest, repeating the word like it was a lifeline. "Mama." And for a moment, Andrew couldn't move, couldn't speak. He wasn't angry. He wasn't sure what he was, only that something deep inside him cracked open like ice in warm water. He didn't say a word, just stood in the doorway watching this woman he barely knew become the center of a world he didn't know how to hold together. Beatrice looked up, eyes locking with his. She didn't smile, she didn't flinch, because she knew there was no taking that word back now. Andrew Davies didn't sleep that night. He didn't drink either, not the usual bourbon, not even a sip. He just sat in his study, staring at the fire like it might offer an answer. He could still hear it, that word, carried on the voice of a little girl who hadn't spoken since she took her first breath. "Mama." And the way his son said it, like he'd been waiting for someone to show up and carry the word out of him, like it had always been there, just locked behind something too heavy for a child to lift alone. Andrew pressed his palms into his eyes. It was just a moment, just a game, maybe, just the maid. So why did it feel like the ground had shifted beneath his feet? Beatrice didn't sleep either. She sat on the edge of her bed, suitcase half packed, staring at the wall like it might tell her what to do. She had crossed a line, she knew that. She had been warned before she took the job, keep it professional, stay out of the children's emotional space. They were fragile. The family was grieving. Don't get too close. But how do you watch a child ache and not move toward them? How do you hear the sound of their voice, their first voice, and not catch it in your hands like it might disappear? Beatrice pulled her sweater tighter around her shoulders. She thought about leaving before sunrise, quiet, simple. That would be safer, cleaner, easier to forget. But then a sound crackled through the baby monitor beside her bed, soft, barely audible. "Ma." She froze. "Ma." Alan's voice in a whisper, like he was practicing in the dark. Her heart cracked in half. She stood up, quietly opened her door, tiptoed down the hall. When she reached the nursery, she didn't step inside. She just stood there, hand on the door frame, watching. Alan had curled up on the rug, blanket under his cheek. Mavis was humming, softly, off-key, and in that moment, Beatrice knew. She couldn't leave. Not yet. The next morning, the house was still quiet, but the silence felt different now, not empty, just holding its breath. Andrew didn't say anything. He passed her in the hall with a glance that didn't quite land. Beatrice nodded, said nothing. At breakfast, the twins looked for her. Alan pointed when she walked by. Mavis tried to climb down from her chair. She smiled gently, motioned for them to eat. But when she turned away, she could feel their eyes stay on her, like they were waiting for something they didn't know how to name. Later that afternoon, Beatrice found herself in the nursery again. Not by instruction, not out of duty. She just couldn't stay away. The twins had pulled out blocks and picture books. Mavis handed her a crayon, babbled something close to a word. Beatrice didn't correct her, she simply listened. Then, without thinking, she began to hum, a melody her mother used to sing when nights stretched long and worries stayed close. Low, gentle, no words, just breath and tone. The children quieted. Alan crawled closer. Mavis leaned into her side, and as the song wrapped around them, something old and holy filled the room. Outside in the hallway, Andrew stood with his back to the wall. He hadn't meant to stop. He hadn't meant to listen. But when he heard that sound again, that softness, that warmth, he didn't move, didn't speak. He just closed his eyes and let it carry him somewhere he hadn't been in years, not since Juliet. Not since the nursery had music. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the doorknob, but he didn't open it. He wasn't ready. Because what was happening in that room felt sacred. And he didn't know yet whether to fight it or fall into it. Andrew Davies avoided the nursery the next day, not out of anger, not fear, but because he didn't trust what he might feel if he walked in. The house had changed. He didn't know when it started exactly. Maybe it was the moment Alan said "Mama," or maybe it had been building slowly in the background, beneath the grief, beneath the rules, beneath everything he thought he was still in control of. Now he heard things he hadn't heard in years, tiny footsteps, the creak of floorboards, little voices testing the edges of sound, and most of all, her voice. Beatrice. It floated through the monitor in his office, soft and steady, not singing this time, just talking, simple, gentle, present, and it unnerved him, because grief had built him a wall, and she, without asking, without trying, was quietly climbing over it. Beatrice never meant to stay this long in the children's orbit. She tried at first to keep her distance again. She folded towels in the laundry room, arranged dishes in silence, swept the hallway slowly, hoping the twins might forget, hoping she might too. But they didn't. Alan followed her into the kitchen that morning, dragging a plastic dinosaur by its tail. Mavis toddled behind, clutching a teacup from the playroom. Beatrice turned, looked at them. She didn't say, "Go back." She didn't say anything. She just knelt down. Mavis climbed into her lap. Alan sat cross-legged beside her, and without meaning to, Beatrice began to hum again. Not a lullaby this time, just the soft rhythmic hum of a hymn her grandmother used to sing when the world felt too loud. The children didn't move. Alan reached for her hand. Mavis laid her head against Beatrice's chest, and the sound that followed, barely audible, was something new. Not quite words, but not nonsense either. "B," Beatrice blinked. "B," she whispered, gently correcting, placing a hand on Mavis's back. The little girl smiled. "B." It was the first time anyone had called her anything here. Not maid, not help, just B. Upstairs, Andrew leaned against the study doorway, one hand on the wall. He had gone to refill his coffee, but paused when he heard them again. Not through the monitor this time, through the floorboards, through the air. It was subtle, but it was there, the vibration of sound, of connection. His fingers tightened slightly on the doorframe. It wasn't jealousy, it wasn't resentment. It was something closer to grief with a pulse, a feeling he thought had died with Juliet, but now it stirred, unfamiliar, restless. He went back to his desk, left the coffee untouched. That night, Beatrice tucked the twins into bed. She stayed longer than she meant to. Mavis had fallen asleep with her fingers tangled in Beatrice's shirt. Alan refused to lie down until she sang something soft. She sat on the rug between their cribs, legs folded, back straight. Then, like muscle memory, her voice filled the space. The same hymn, just a little slower, a little more worn. "Mama," Alan mumbled once, already drifting. Beatrice kissed his forehead. "No, baby," she whispered. "I'm just B." But he didn't respond. He was already gone. What she didn't know, what she never saw, was Andrew, just outside the doorway again. He'd come to say good night, just once, just to try. But then he heard the song, and once again, he didn't move. He couldn't, because there was something sacred in her voice, not performance, not duty, just presence. And presence had been missing from this house for so long, he'd almost forgotten what it sounded like. He stood there long after her song faded, long after the lights dimmed, just listening, not to the children, not to the words, but to the sound of something he didn't think he'd ever hear again in this house. Warmth. Beatrice hadn't meant to find the photo. It slipped out while she was organizing a forgotten drawer in the guest bedroom, just a thin, slightly curled print, wedged behind old letters and unused batteries. A family portrait. Andrew, his wife Juliet, glowing and very pregnant. A golden afternoon caught in stillness, joy still alive in the corners of their smiles. Beatrice held it longer than she should have, then gently placed it back where it belonged, centered on the dresser beneath the edge of a vase. Some things deserved to be seen again. She had grown careful now, not distant, but quieter around Andrew. He hadn't said a word to her since the day in the parlour, not one. But he looked, not often, not obviously, but she felt it, his eyes in the doorway just out of frame, in the nursery, in the kitchen, sometimes in the garden, where she sat cross-legged while the twins drew on scraps of cardboard with broken crayons. There was a heaviness to his silence, not rejection, not judgment, something else, something watching, something waiting. One night, Mavis had trouble sleeping. Beatrice stayed beside her crib until the little girl's breathing softened, but she didn't leave right away. Instead, she turned to Alan, who lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thumb resting against his lip. Beatrice reached for a worn blanket, pulled it over him and whispered, "There's a star outside your window, the biggest one. It watches you every night." Alan blinked. Quiet. She continued, "I think your mama is up there." Behind her, Mavis stirred. A small hand reached out through the crib bars and found the edge of Beatrice's sleeve. She didn't move. She stayed, just breathing with them, holding space. She didn't know he was there. Andrew, leaning against the hallway wall, just outside the door, listening. He had come to check in, just to see. But her voice stopped him. He didn't hear pity in it, or performance, just presence. Again. Something no one had given his children in a very long time. Something he hadn't given himself. The next morning, the twins found her in the laundry room, humming softly as she folded towels. Mavis brought a sock. Alan brought a crayon. They sat at her feet, like they belonged there. "B," Mavis whispered. Beatrice smiled, reached down and touched the girl's cheek. "Morning, baby." From the top of the stairs, Andrew watched. The maid, his children, the warmth between them. Not a scene he expected, but not one he could look away from either. He didn't smile, he didn't speak. He just stood there, one hand on the banister, heart steady but unsettled, because she wasn't trying to take anyone's place. And yet, somehow, she had become something this house couldn't do without. Later that night, Beatrice stood outside the nursery with her hand resting on the doorknob. She could still hear the twins babbling to each other. Nonsense sounds that felt like magic compared to the silence they once knew, but her thoughts were elsewhere, on the photo, on the man at the edge of every room, on the ache that lived behind all their quiet. She wanted to tell someone what it felt like, to matter to children who weren't hers, to hold space in a house that didn't have room for her name, to feel needed in a way that made her afraid to stay, and more afraid to leave. But there was no one to tell. Only this hallway, only this door, and the sound of a home slowly learning how to breathe again. The sound of tires on gravel wasn't unusual, but something about that morning felt different, sharper, heavier. Beatrice was in the kitchen when she heard the front door open, not with a click, but a command. Heels struck marble. Fast, rhythmic, unapologetic. She turned just in time to see the woman enter. Elegant, perfect posture, expensive perfume trailing behind her like a second voice, hair set like porcelain, pearls tight at the throat. Evelyn Davies had arrived. Andrew didn't know she was coming. His mother never announced her visits. She believed surprise was the best way to catch people being honest, and this time she didn't waste a moment. "I see the children are still alive," she said, brushing past him with a kiss that never landed. Her eyes scanned the foyer, the furniture, the maid. Beatrice straightened without meaning to. Evelyn's gaze landed, stayed. "So, this is the help?" Alan ran into the room barefoot, holding a crumpled drawing, bright colors, a stick figure with wild hair and big hands. He held it up proudly. "Ma!" The room stilled. Evelyn froze mid-step. Andrew's breath caught. Beatrice didn't move. "I'm sorry. What did he say?" Evelyn asked, sharp as glass. "He meant B," Andrew offered, voice quiet. "It's what they call her." Evelyn turned, slowly. "That's not what I heard." Later that afternoon, Beatrice stood at the sink, hands in soapy water, trying to breathe judgment through the tightness in her chest. In whispers, in rules, in looks that said, "Don't forget who you are, what you're here for." But something about today sliced deeper. She wasn't ashamed of the bond, not with the twins. But now, that bond had a witness, and that witness saw it as a threat. In the nursery, Mavis pressed her crayon drawing into Beatrice's hand. 3 figures, 1 taller, 2 small, all holding hands. "Ma," she whispered again. Beatrice's eyes stung. She knelt, smoothed the girl's hair back. "I'm not her baby," she said softly, "but I'm here." Upstairs, Andrew stood in his father's old study, staring out at the lawn. Evelyn stood beside him, arms crossed, her voice low and slicing. "This woman, you've let her get too close." Andrew didn't respond. "I get it," she added. "You're lonely. The children are lost. But this is dangerous." He didn't look at her. "You saw the way he said it. Mama, that word belongs to someone who's gone, not a housekeeper from Memphis." Still, he said nothing. Evelyn sighed. "You're grieving. I understand. But grief doesn't make strangers into mothers." Beatrice heard the words later, not directly, not shouted, just loud enough to bleed through the floorboards. "That word belongs to someone who's gone." She stood still in the hallway, the drawing still clutched in her hand. Something tightened in her throat, thick and familiar. Not anger, just the ache of being reminded that love, in some houses, had rules. That night she wrote a letter, not a complaint, not a cry for anything, just ink on paper, simple words. "I never meant to take her place. I only wanted to be kind. I hope they remember that part." She left it folded, quietly by the front door. And then she packed a bag, not because she wanted to go, but because she wasn't sure she was allowed to stay. The letter was small, just 1 sheet, folded twice, no envelope, no signature. Beatrice placed it on the front porch just before dawn, right on the stone step where the milk delivery used to come. No one saw her leave. That's how she wanted it. She didn't take much. A suitcase with soft clothes, the framed photo her sister had sent last Christmas, and the drawing. The one Mavis made, 3 figures, hand in hand, under a sun too big for the page. Beatrice slipped it into her bag like a prayer, then she turned around, one last look at the house, and walked away. Andrew found the letter at sunrise. He stepped outside for air, barefoot on the cold stone, expecting nothing but silence. Instead he found words, written in neat handwriting, trembling just slightly at the ends. "I never meant to take her place. I only wanted to be kind. I hope they remember that part." He read it once, then again, and by the 3rd time his hands were shaking. Upstairs the nursery was still. No footsteps, no laughter. Just quiet. Too quiet. Mavis lay curled in her crib, her thumb pressed to her lips, eyes wide. Alan sat on the rug, holding a toy airplane, unmoving. They hadn't spoken since she left. Not a word. Andrew stood in the doorway, helpless. He tried. He knelt beside them, offered a book, a song. But they didn't reach for him, didn't respond. They were waiting for someone. Someone who wasn't coming back. He went to the kitchen, found her teacup still in the sink, a smudge of lipstick on the rim. The last trace of a presence that had become too quiet to notice, until it was gone. He pressed a hand to his chest and closed his eyes. He hadn't told her to leave, hadn't said anything at all. And now the silence that returned wasn't the same as before. It was worse, because this silence knew what it had lost. Later that day, he opened the closet near the laundry room, found her sweater still hanging on the hook. Worn, soft, faded at the sleeves. He touched it, just once. It smelled like the twins' shampoo. Evelyn stood in the foyer, suitcase in hand, preparing to leave for Palm Beach. "Everything's back to normal now," she said. Andrew looked at her. Not with anger, not even disappointment. Just a quiet realization that normal wasn't the same as whole. He said nothing. She left. And the house exhaled in a way that didn't feel like relief. That evening, he tucked the children into bed. Alone. Alan clutched a blanket that smelled faintly like her. Mavis didn't close her eyes, just stared at the ceiling, blinking slowly, like she was waiting for someone to appear in the stars. And when Andrew leaned in to kiss her goodnight, she turned her face away. His chest cracked open. He sat on the floor between their cribs, head in his hands, the silence pressing in. He thought of the word they had finally spoken, the one they hadn't said since she left. Mama. He whispered it into the stillness, as if maybe it would summon something back, but only the shadows answered. That night he didn't sleep. He packed a bag, threw clothes into a duffel, shoes, diapers, wipes, and the drawing. He buckled the twins into the back seat of his truck before the sun came up. No driver, no staff, just him and them, and a destination. He typed an address into his phone. Memphis. He didn't know if she'd open the door, but they had to try. Beatrice hadn't unpacked her suitcase. 3 days in Memphis and everything still sat folded, untouched, at the foot of her cousin's guest bed. She told herself it was temporary, but even that felt like a lie. She moved slowly through the small house, making tea she didn't drink, checking her phone without purpose. She didn't expect a call, or a message. Not from him. Not from anyone in that house. Still, she kept it close. She spent the mornings scrolling through old photos. Not of herself, but of them. Alan with paint on his chin. Mavis asleep on her shoulder, one sock missing. Blurry moments she had captured without thinking, now clutched like proof that it hadn't all been in her head. Sometimes she pressed play on the short videos. The laughter, the voices, that word, Mama. She always stopped them before the end. She couldn't bear to hear it fade. That afternoon she sat on the porch steps, wrapped in a sweater 2 sizes too big, watching the wind push leaves down the sidewalk. Her cousin was inside with the baby. Music played faintly through the window. Beatrice didn't hear the car at first, only the sound of a door closing. Then another. Then 2 small feet hitting the pavement. Then... And there they were, Alan running toward her with both arms outstretched, eyes wide, voice full. Mama. Behind him, Mavis followed with clumsy, eager steps, clutching a crumpled paper in her hand. Beatrice didn't move, not right away. It took her a moment to believe what she was seeing, and then she dropped to her knees. Alan collided into her chest. Mavis wrapped herself around her side. They were crying, laughing, speaking. "B," Mavis whispered. "Home." Beatrice's throat closed. She held them tight, one hand on each small back, pressing them into her, like she could anchor herself with their weight. Her face buried in their hair, tears catching in her breath. She didn't ask how or why. She just held them, because whatever this moment was, it was real. When she finally looked up, Andrew was standing at the edge of the driveway. No suit, no briefcase, just wrinkled slacks, tired eyes, and something in his hands. It was the drawing, the one with the sun and the stick figures. He didn't speak right away. He just knelt beside her, slowly, like someone approaching holy ground. "They wouldn't stop asking," he said quietly. "For you." Beatrice blinked, stunned. His voice broke as he added, "And I didn't know how much I needed you too." There was a silence between them then, full of everything neither had said. He looked down at the twins, both still clinging to her, then back at her. "I don't care what anyone says. You gave them back their voices. You gave me back my children." A pause. Deep breath. You gave that house back its heart. He swallowed. Will you come home? Beatrice looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time since the day they met. She saw the man beneath the grief, the father who had broken, and the one who was willing to rebuild. She didn't answer right away. She just nodded, eyes full, arms still wrapped around the only two reasons she had stayed as long as she had in the first place. And in that small driveway in Memphis, everything shifted, not loudly, not all at once, but enough. The gates opened slowly. No driver, no staff waiting at the door. Just Beatrice, stepping out of Andrew's truck with one twin on each side of her, Alan holding her hand, Mavis refusing to let go of her leg. No one spoke. The front door creaked open, and for a second she stood still. That house had once swallowed her whole. Now it waited for her return like it knew what it had lost. She walked in. Not as the maid. Not anymore. The staff didn't ask questions, not out loud, but the difference was felt immediately. The children clung to her, like a thread they refused to drop. And the way Andrew stood nearby, not hovering but there, spoke louder than permission. Something had changed. Beatrice moved through the kitchen like it was familiar now. She knew which cabinet stuck, which drawer squeaked. She opened windows, let the light in, turned on music, low, gentle, warm. Alan swayed without meaning to. Mavis danced with bare feet on tile. Beatrice smiled. The house exhaled. At lunch, the cook called her Miss Taylor without being told to. Not habit, not sarcasm, respect. She nodded, grateful, quiet. The children babbled through their meal, fingers sticky with jelly. Andrew sat at the head of the table, eyes soft, watching something he never expected to see again. A family in motion. Later, in the hallway just outside the nursery, Beatrice paused. Framed on the wall, right where the old oil paintings once hung, was something new. She stepped closer. It was them. Beatrice kneeling in the garden, arms wrapped around the twins, dirt on their hands, sun on their cheeks. Andrew stood behind them, one hand resting gently on her shoulder. She hadn't seen it before, didn't know it had been printed, but it was there. Hung like it had always belonged. Upstairs, Evelyn arrived unannounced. Again, pearls, purse, cold eyes. She didn't say much this time. Just stood in the foyer, scanning the scene like she didn't understand how it all unfolded without her permission. Beatrice walked past her, holding Mavis on her hip. Alan followed, dragging a stuffed bear by the arm. "Mama," he said, pointing at the photo in the hallway. Evelyn's lips parted. "That's not—" But Andrew stepped forward before she could finish. "She is something to them," he said softly. "Maybe more than anyone else has been." Evelyn looked at him, then at Beatrice, but no one flinched this time. And the moment passed without her. That night, Beatrice sat on the rug between the cribs. The twins had fallen asleep quickly, one hand on her knee, one cheek on her shoulder. She didn't sing, not this time. She just breathed with them. Slow, safe, steady. From the hallway, Andrew watched. He didn't enter. He didn't need to. She was home, and the house knew it. In the stillness, something had shifted. Not just the energy, not just the way the children slept, but the walls themselves felt different now, as if they had stopped bracing for loss and finally made room for presence. No one declared it. No one gave it a name. But in that quiet, sacred space, the house had begun to breathe again. The courtroom wasn't large, fluorescent lights, worn carpet, a wooden bench that creaked beneath Andrew's weight. Beatrice sat beside him, fingers laced in her lap, knees steady, but her breath wasn't. The twins fidgeted between them. Mavis held a coloring book upside down. Alan kept looking at the judge like he wasn't sure if she was allowed to smile. She did. Then glanced down at the papers in front of her and read each name aloud, clear, slow, careful. Alan Davies. Mavis Davies. Beatrice Taylor Davies. The pen scratched softly as she signed the final form. And just like that, it was done. Legal, binding. permanent, not the beginning of love, just the proof of it. Outside the courthouse, Beatrice stood in the sunlight like she hadn't seen it in years. Alan wrapped his arms around her waist. Mavis pulled at her skirt, wanting to be lifted. Beatrice laughed through tears as she crouched and held them both. Andrew watched from a few feet away, then walked forward. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. He just placed his hand gently on her back and whispered, "We made it." Beatrice looked at him, eyes full, not with disbelief anymore, not fear, but something quieter, trust. Back at the house, the staff gathered near the foyer. No speeches, no champagne, just warmth. The cook baked a cake. One of the groundskeepers brought fresh flowers from the garden. Andrew hung a new frame in the hallway. 4 people this time, all holding hands, under a crooked sun and the word home written in bright red crayon. He didn't fix the spelling. He left it exactly as it was. That night, the house felt different, not in volume, but in weight. The air wasn't heavy anymore. It held something else. Presence. Peace. The kind that doesn't shout, but settles deep into the walls. In the nursery, the cribs were gone, replaced by twin beds on either side of a soft rug. Beatrice sat between them, legs stretched out, arms resting on tiny blankets. The twins lay curled beneath matching quilts, their fingers still reaching for her. Mavis spoke first. "Bea," she turned. "Yes, baby." "Are you really ours now?" Beatrice didn't answer right away. She looked at them, at these 2 voices that once lived in silence, and nodded. "I've always been yours." Alan's voice came next. "Forever." Her throat tightened. "Forever." Downstairs, Andrew stood in the kitchen, pouring water into a glass, watching her shadow move upstairs through the light beneath the nursery door. He smiled, soft, small, the kind of smile that doesn't ask for attention, the kind that lives in the space where grief once was and love now stays. He took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, it didn't hurt. Later that night, Beatrice walked through the quiet hallway toward her room. The framed drawing caught her eye. She paused, 3 words written in shaky handwriting under the stick-figure sun. "This is family." She touched the glass gently, then turned out the light. The house didn't go quiet again, not like before. The silence now was full, alive, breathing. Because sometimes the word that breaks you is also the word that builds you. For Andrew, that word had been mama. But now, it was something else entirely. Family.